In the harsh, windswept landscapes of Greenland, life was a test of endurance and ingenuity. The snow-covered fjords stretched endlessly, their icy surfaces shimmering under the low northern sun. The Norse settlers, driven from Iceland by both exile and ambition, had carved out lives on these unforgiving shores. Each day was a negotiation with nature, a battle to survive, to build, and to endure. Eric the Red, the man whose name had become legend, led this pioneering effort. Fierce, ambitious and unyielding, he had been banished from Iceland not once, but twice, leaving him to seek a new home at the very edge of the known world. Greenland was that home, a land both beautiful and brutal, with glaciers that gleamed white and waters so cold that they seemed to bite at the very bones of the living. Yet Eric's vision was clear. Here they could carve a life far from the constraints and conflicts of Iceland. The settlements were sparse, scattered along the fjords. Turf houses, built from the soil and stone of the land, rose modestly from the snow. They were simple, sturdy structures designed to endure the long, bitter winters. Smoke curled from their chimneys, a faint ribbon against the grey sky, signaling warmth, safety, and human persistence in a land that seemed, at times, merciless. Within these walls, families gathered, tending fires and preparing what little sustenance the land could offer. Dried fish, seal meat, and butter were staples, supplemented occasionally by the meager harvests of barley, hardy root vegetables, and herbs that struggled to survive in the rocky soil. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, was born into this world of scarcity and endurance. From a young age, he learned the rhythms of survival. How to track game across frozen tundra, how to fish in rivers that ran like silver threads through the harsh landscape, and how to read the signs of weather that could shift in an instant. Tales of sagas and distant lands filled his early years, stories of courage, exile, and discovery that shaped his imagination and fueled his ambition. He grew up knowing that life was a test, that comfort was rare, and that the horizon always promised more than the eye could see. The Norse in Greenland were more than survivors. They were pioneers, with a legacy of exploration hardwired into their bones. They raised sheep and cattle where the soil permitted, hunted seals and birds along the fjords, and traded furs and hides, both to sustain themselves and to maintain connections with distant settlements in Iceland and Norway. Their lives were marked by a combination of routine and uncertainty. Each day brought labor and hardship, yet the possibility of opportunity lingered, whispered in the wind across the icy plains. Leif's education was both formal and practical. He learned the runes and the stories of his people, the sagas of gods and heroes, but he also learned the skills that would one day make him a great explorer. Sailing, fishing, hunting, and navigation were not lessons from books. They were lessons from the world itself. He watched his father carve timber for houses and ships, noting every stroke of the axe, every joint and beam, understanding that mastery of the material world was just as important as knowledge of stories. The sea, in particular, held a fascination for Leif. Unlike the fjords, trapped in ice for much of the year, the Atlantic promised adventure and possibility. Stories reached Greenland of lands to the west, forests and rivers where wild grapes grew, and soil rich enough to sustain both men and livestock. Sailors returning from the edges of the known world whispered of distant shores, whispering of opportunity and risk in the same breath. To Leif, these tales were not mere stories. They were invitations, challenges, and blueprints for destiny. Daily life in Greenland demanded discipline. Winters were long, dark, and cold, and the settlers learned to prepare meticulously. Fish and seal meat were salted or dried to last through the months when hunting was impossible. Firewood had to be carefully stacked, and homes insulated with turf and stone. The Norse were practical, resilient, and stubborn, qualities necessary to survive where nature was both beautiful and deadly. Yet amidst the struggle, there were moments of joy. Children played in the snow, families shared meals by the fire, and stories of distant lands and heroic deeds offered warmth to hearts chilled by the relentless cold. Eric the Red, though aging and mindful of past dangers, nurtured Leif's ambition. He told him of Iceland, of battles and exiles, of the seas that connected the world, and of the possibilities beyond the horizon. These tales were cautionary as well as inspiring. Life demanded respect for the power of nature, the limits of human endurance, and the unpredictability of fortune. Leif absorbed these lessons, understanding that courage without wisdom could lead to ruin. In the settlements, life was communal. Men worked together to build homes, repair boats, and hunt game, while women managed the domestic sphere, prepared food, and tended to children. The labor was hard and survival depended on cooperation. Yet even in this harsh world, Norse culture thrived. Festivals marked the passing of seasons. Feasts celebrated successful hunts or harvests. And songs and stories preserved the memory of gods, ancestors, and heroes. Religion and culture intertwined with survival, creating a society resilient not only to the elements but to the isolation of life on the edge of the known world. As Leif grew, he watched his father navigate not just Greenland's landscapes, but its politics. Settlers often disagreed, old rivalries lingered, and conflicts with nearby communities, including occasional contact with indigenous peoples, reminded them that even on the frontier, diplomacy and caution were as necessary as strength. Eric the Red's leadership combined firmness with strategy, teaching Leif that survival demanded both courage and calculation. By the time Leif reached adulthood, the stories of lands to the west had grown from whispers to visions. He saw the possibilities that Greenland could not provide: fertile soil, forests rich with timber, and rivers teeming with fish. Every voyage westward from Greenland carried tales of islands and coasts unclaimed, offering opportunities for those bold enough to take them. Leif's imagination and courage coalesced around a single idea: to sail further, to discover and perhaps to claim land beyond the frozen north. Preparation for such a voyage was not trivial. Provisions had to be gathered, ships repaired and tested, and men trained for both labor and potential conflict. Leif's experience in Greenland, combined with the practical skills inherited from his father and elders, made him a natural leader. His charisma inspired confidence among the men, while his practical knowledge ensured their survival at sea. The Norse understood that exploration was as much about preparation as it was about courage. As spring thawed the ice and opened the fjords, Leif and his growing cadre of followers began planning. Maps were crude, knowledge of currents and winds passed down orally. Every detail mattered: how to navigate with the sun and stars, how to read the flight of birds, how to detect distant land from the color of the sea. These were not mere sailors. They were explorers in the truest sense, relying on instinct, experience, and the wisdom of generations. The dreams of a land to the west were no longer distant fantasies. They had become a mission. Leif, fueled by the stories of sailors and his own vision, resolved to journey further than any Norse had ventured. Greenland had taught him the value of preparation, the necessity of courage, and the harsh lessons of survival. Yet it had also shown him the possibilities that lay beyond the known. The horizon was not a boundary. It was an invitation. In these early days, the men of Greenland watched, listened, and speculated. Some were eager for adventure, others were cautious, aware of the dangers and the unknown. But Leif's conviction was infectious. He spoke not only of discovery, but of opportunity: fertile land, rich timber, and perhaps a chance to secure a legacy beyond the frozen fjords. The Norse valued practical rewards as much as glory, and the promise of Vinland, a land whispered about in tales with grapes and forests and rivers, was enough to inspire even the most hesitant among them. The first steps toward exploration required courage, endurance, and unity. The Norse understood that the sea was not an obstacle, but a pathway. Their ancestors had crossed oceans before, and they trusted in the knowledge passed down through generations. Leif Erikson embodied this tradition. A man shaped by Greenland's hardships, inspired by Icelandic sagas, and driven by the vision of a new world to the west. And so, as spring turned towards summer, as the fjords melted into navigable waterways, and as the ice retreated from the shorelines, Leif began preparations for the voyage that would define his life. Timber was gathered, provisions packed, and a crew assembled. Each man knew the risks: storms, icebergs, scarcity, and the unknown. Yet each also knew the potential rewards: discovery, land, and the chance to leave a mark upon the world. The people of Greenland watched, some with awe, some with apprehension, as the Nar, broad-bellied, sturdy, and built for long voyages, was readied. Its single square sail, dyed red and brown, would soon catch the northern winds, carrying Leif and his men into the annals of history. Beyond the fjords lay uncertainty, challenge, and danger. But beyond them also lay the promise of Vinland, a land that would become legend, carved forever into the memory of Norse exploration and the imagination of the world. By the year 1000, Leif Erikson was ready to test the horizon. Greenland had taught him resilience, resourcefulness, and the endurance needed to survive in the harshest conditions, but the Atlantic called to him with whispers of lands beyond the known world. Tales of fertile coasts, dense forests, and rivers brimming with fish had reached the northern settlements through sailors' tales, and for Leif, these stories were more than myth. They were invitations to destiny. As spring arrived and ice retreated from the fjords, Leif gathered a crew of about 35 men. These were not adventurers seeking glory alone. They were hardened farmers, skilled hunters, and experienced sailors, all accustomed to the moods of the North Atlantic. Each man understood the unforgiving power of the ocean, the dangers of icebergs, and the unpredictability of storms. Their ship, a Nar, a broad-bellied cargo vessel, was chosen for its stability and capacity, capable of carrying both men and provisions, as well as livestock, timber, and trade goods, essential for survival on unknown shores. Unlike the long, sleek ships of raiders, the Nar moved steadily, absorbing the Atlantic's tumultuous waves while keeping its precious cargo secure. Provisioning was meticulous. Salted and dried fish, seal meat, barley, butter, and ale were packed in abundance, along with tools, weapons, and spare timber. Every crew member understood that the ocean offered no second chances. Preparation was survival. They studied the skies, memorized the currents, and listened to the stories of returning sailors. Navigation, for the Norse, was as much art as science. They read the sun's path by day, the stars by night, and noted the flight of birds, the smell of the sea, and even the color of water against the ship's hull to predict land. Legends spoke of the sunstone, a crystal said to reveal the sun's position even on cloudy days, symbolizing the ingenuity of Norse navigation. Whether myth or tool, it reflected the skill and intelligence required to traverse the unknown. The journey began with cautious optimism. Greenland's fjords receded into the distance as the Nar's red and brown sail caught the northern wind. The men adjusted to the rhythm of the sea, hauling oars, adjusting sails, bailing water, and maintaining constant vigilance. Storms tested their resolve. Waves crashed over the deck, and icy spray chilled them to the bone. Yet Leif's confidence never wavered. He had grown up understanding that the horizon was not a limit, but a challenge, a path to opportunity and discovery. Days stretched into weeks. Doubt and fatigue crept among the men, but the promise of land beyond the ocean kept their spirits alive. Each sunrise brought hope, each sunset reflection. At times, the sea seemed endless, a grey expanse punctuated only by distant gulls or floating ice, and yet The Norse were patient, their eyes scanning the horizon for even the faintest sign of land. They knew that survival required both courage and faith in the skills honed over generations. At last, on a morning when the wind was steady and the sun pierced through lingering clouds, the first signs of land appeared. A faint smudge on the horizon, uncertain and elusive, stirred excitement among the crew. Could it be the fertile shores the tales promised, or merely a trick of the mist? As they drew closer, the smudge sharpened into a coastline unlike anything they had seen in Greenland. Rolling hills, dense forests and rivers meandering through meadows revealed a land abundant and inviting. Leif stepped forward as the Nar approached a sheltered bay. His boots touched the soft earth of Vinland, and the crew fanned out, eyes wide with awe. Streams of fresh water glimmered in the sunlight, wild game rustled through the underbrush, and birds filled the sky with song. The richness of the land was unlike the icy barrenness of Greenland. Here was promise, soil for cultivation, timber for construction, rivers for fishing, and vines heavy with fruit. According to the sagas, the discovery of wild grapes inspired the name Vinland, the land of wine. Whether actual grapes or another fruit misidentified, the symbol of abundance was clear to the Norse explorers. Exploration began immediately. Small groups fanned into forests and along rivers, mapping the land, noting resources, and assessing potential threats. Timber, abundant and of superior quality to Greenland's sparse woodlands, promised building materials for houses, ships, and tools. Streams teemed with salmon, easy to catch and plentiful, while forests offered deer, elk, and birds. Meadows suggested potential pasture for livestock. Every step revealed both the generosity of the land and the opportunities it offered for settlement or resource collection. Evenings were filled with reflection and celebration. Fires burned brightly as men roasted fish and tasted wild berries. The sense of achievement was palpable, a mixture of relief, wonder, and ambition. Leif's leadership combined caution with vision. He organized expeditions, assigned men to guard the ship, and ensured that the exploration was systematic. His decisions balanced immediate survival with long-term opportunity, a hallmark of his strategic mind. Yet the Norse were aware that the land was not uninhabited. They called the local peoples Skraelings, noting their distinct appearance, language, and customs. Initial contact was cautious. The Norse offered tools, red cloth, and milk, while the Skraelings presented animal pelts, food, and goods unfamiliar to the newcomers. These early exchanges suggested that trade and interaction might be possible, that both peoples could benefit from cooperation. However, mistrust grew quickly. The Norse carried weapons, as all Norsemen did, and their presence reminded the Skraelings of the threat they posed. Small incidents, miscommunications, or misunderstandings often escalated into conflict. One saga recounts a skirmish sparked by the Norse bulls frightening the natives. Another describes a trade dispute, perhaps over milk or cloth, that erupted into violence. Arrows flew, stones were hurled, and the Norse were forced to defend their camp. These clashes highlighted a fundamental truth. The land was rich, but it was contested, and survival depended on both diplomacy and defense. Life in Vinland combined wonder with constant vigilance. The men fished, hunted, and gathered berries, while also patrolling and fortifying their temporary settlement. Turf houses and wooden structures provided shelter, but the awareness of potential attacks never left them. Leif's leadership was crucial. He balanced exploration with security, ensuring that the men were both productive and prepared. The Norse understood that the land's bounty could not compensate for unpreparedness or hubris. Despite these challenges, Vinland offered experiences impossible in Greenland. Grapes stained the hands and mouths of the Norse, berries were abundant, and timber stretched endlessly. The forests were rich, the rivers generous, and the meadows open. This land was a stark contrast to the harsh, rocky and icy landscapes they had known, and it ignited dreams of permanent settlement and prosperity. Yet the reality of conflict with the Skraelings tempered those dreams. The Norse experimented with their surroundings, gathering wood for construction, observing wildlife, and assessing the soil's fertility. Temporary fields were marked, areas for livestock noted, and resources catalogued. The knowledge gained during these early days would inform future voyages, even if permanent settlement proved impossible. The men began to understand Vinland as both opportunity and challenge, a land that could sustain life but demanded respect for its existing inhabitants. As the weeks passed, the Norse held tentative relations with the Skraelings. Trade offered short-term benefits, but trust was fragile. Each encounter carried potential for friendship or violence. Both groups assessed the other's intentions, and skirmishes reminded the Norse that they were outsiders. Leif's experience, combined with his strategic foresight, ensured that the settlement remained viable, but he also recognized the limits of their numbers. With only 35 men, any sustained conflict could jeopardize the entire endeavor. The Naar became both home and lifeline. Provisions were carefully managed, and resources from the land supplemented their stores. The Norse observed the rhythms of Vinland, the migrations of animals, the growth of berries, the tides of the rivers, and integrated these patterns into their routines. They adapted as they had in Greenland and Iceland, learning to read the land as a living guide. Despite constant vigilance, the crew marveled at the natural abundance around them. Salmon swam easily in the rivers, deer moved through the forests with little fear, and berries and nuts provided nourishment and flavor. Timber, straight and tall, promised the materials for long-term construction. Grapes and other wild fruits symbolized plenty and inspired a vision of settlement beyond mere resource extraction. Yet Vinland remained a land of uncertainty. The Norse were acutely aware that survival depended not only on what they could take from the land, but on how they navigated relations with its original inhabitants. Every arrow fired, every misunderstanding, reminded them that opportunity came with risk. Leif's decisions balanced ambition with caution, ensuring that his crew could reap the benefits of Vinland without succumbing to its dangers. As the first explorations drew to a close, the Norse prepared for the next stage, assessing the land for potential long-term occupation. They catalogued resources, strengthened temporary structures, and maintained a defensive posture. Leif's vision was expansive, but pragmatic. He knew that Vinland's richness alone would not secure a foothold. Strategy, foresight, and respect for the realities of human interaction were essential. Vinland's discovery marked a turning point, not only for Leif Erikson, but for Norse exploration as a whole. It proved that the Atlantic could be crossed, that fertile lands lay beyond Greenland, and that human courage and skill could extend the reach of civilization into unknown worlds. The land was generous, promising, yet contested, and the Norse learned lessons that would resonate through generations. Exploration was as much about wisdom and preparation as it was about daring. In the end, Vinland's shores welcomed the Norse not as conquerors, but as visitors. Grapes, timber, rivers, and meadows offered abundance, but they also carried the reminder that opportunity came with responsibility and risk. Leif Erikson's journey would become legend, recorded in sagas and passed through generations, a testament to human curiosity, courage, and the eternal call of the horizon. The Norse settlement on the shores of Vinland had begun to take shape, modest yet purposeful. Under the leadership of Leif Erikson, men and women alike followed a daily rhythm of survival and adaptation. At dawn, groups of men would venture into the rivers and streams, where salmon leapt in astonishing numbers, their silver scales glinting in the morning sun. Other men hunted game, tracking deer and bear through the dense forests, while waterfowl were caught along the marshy edges. Each catch was either roasted over open fires for immediate consumption or preserved with salt and smoke for leaner days. The women played an equally critical role, gathering nuts, berries and edible plants from the forests, chopping wood for the hearths, and managing the daily organization of the camp. Every task, though routine, was underscored by the understanding that Vinland was both generous and unforgiving. The land itself seemed to offer plenty, but it demanded respect, skill, and vigilance. The Skraelings, the native peoples of the region, watched the newcomers with cautious eyes. Initial exchanges between the Norse and the Skraelings were tentative but promising. The Norse offered red cloth, iron tools, and milk, novelties that intrigued the natives, while the Skraelings traded pelts, hides, and food, showcasing their own mastery of the land. For a brief period, hope arose that a peaceful coexistence might be possible, a fragile bridge built across cultures, separated by oceans and lifetimes of different experiences. Yet this fragile peace soon began to fray. The Norse, trained in the arts of war, carried weapons at all times, even during exchanges meant for trade. Their iron swords and axes were a visible reminder that their friendship rested on a thin line between diplomacy and conflict. Small incidents, seemingly trivial, escalated into skirmishes. One story tells of a bull belonging to the Norse wandering near a Skraeling settlement, its loud bellowing frightening the natives and provoking a violent reaction. Another account speaks of a dispute over milk or cloth during trade that erupted into chaos. Arrows flew, stones were hurled, and suddenly the Norse found their settlement under attack, the fragile sense of security shattered. Leif Erikson, experienced and cautious, implemented measures to protect the camp. Men were stationed to guard dwellings and stored resources, while smaller parties ventured into the forests to gather timber, hunt game, and collect berries. Each group understood the risk. The Skraelings were swift and knowledgeable of the land, capable of launching attacks at any moment. Despite these dangers, the Norse took full advantage of the resources Vinland offered. Timber was felled and stacked, fish were caught in abundance, berries and fruits were gathered, and game was hunted. These resources were not only vital for immediate survival, but also envisioned as supplies for potential expansion or to support Greenland back home. Encounters with the Skraelings were unpredictable. Tension could ignite from the smallest misunderstanding. Their attacks were strategic and often sudden, forcing the Norse to rely on both combat skills and careful planning. Each arrow that whistled through the trees, each shout from the forests, reminded the Norse that Vinland, while bountiful, was not unclaimed territory. Their few numbers, only about 35 men and a handful of women, were constantly tested against a population that knew the land intimately. Despite these challenges, life in Vinland continued with its own rhythm. Men fished, hunted, and cut wood. Women gathered food, tended to daily needs, and aided in the defense of the settlement. Nights around the hearth were filled with stories from home, recounting Icelandic and Greenlandic sagas, reflecting on the voyage across the Atlantic, and imagining what the future of Vinland might hold. Some dreamed of permanent farms and children growing among the forests and rivers rather than frozen tundra. Others cautioned that Vinland might only serve as a seasonal outpost, a place to harvest timber and food before returning to familiar shores. The abundance of Vinland was undeniable. Rivers teemed with salmon, forests provided timber of unmatched quality, and the land was dotted with wild grapes, berries, and fertile clearings. Yet these gifts came with constant reminders of the precarious position the Norse held. Every hunt required awareness of potential Skraeling ambushes. Every venture into the woods was balanced with the risk of confrontation. Trade, which initially seemed a bridge between cultures, was increasingly shadowed by suspicion and fear. Leif Erikson's leadership was defined by pragmatism and foresight. He recognized that survival required more than bravery. It demanded strategy, preparation and flexibility. Teams were organized with rotation schedules for hunting, gathering, and defending the settlement. Timber and food were stored efficiently. Paths were cleared for safer movement, and lookout points were established to monitor potential skraeling movements. The Norse understood that Vinland's promise of abundance could only be realized through discipline and caution. Even within the settlement, lessons were constantly reinforced. Women and men alike learned to balance the act of living with the necessity of vigilance. The Norse built temporary shelters from turf and timber, fires were maintained, and each day's labor reinforced both physical endurance and community cohesion. Knowledge passed down from Greenland and Iceland proved invaluable as the Norse adapted their skills to the new environment. They learned which berries were safe, which rivers held the best fish, and which forest paths allowed for quick travel or effective defense. Despite the hardships, moments of wonder and joy persisted. The Norse marveled at Vineland's forests stretching endlessly, at salmon that could be caught by hand, and at grapes so abundant that hands and lips stained purple. These small joys reminded the settlers why the voyage had been undertaken in the first place. Vinland was more than a testing ground. It was a place of possibility, where dreams of abundance were tangible, even if fraught with danger. Yet with every day came the reminder that Vinland's richness came with limits. The Skraelings, though initially curious and sometimes friendly, remained vigilant and protective of their land. Encounters often escalated quickly, forcing the Norse to assess risk constantly. Hunting trips required armed escorts, and even the most routine activities demanded readiness. The balance between utilizing the land's bounty and respecting the presence of the Skraelings was delicate and often tested. As weeks passed, the Norse realized that Vinland's greatest lesson lay not only in its resources, but in the wisdom required to navigate life on contested ground. Their survival depended as much on foresight, adaptability, and diplomacy as on strength and skill. Each day was an exercise in judgment: when to harvest, when to hunt, when to retreat, and when to engage. These lessons, taught by Vinland itself, would shape not only this expedition, but the understanding of exploration for generations to come. By the end of this period, Leif Erikson and his crew had gained a profound appreciation for Vinland. They had fished its rivers, hunted its forests, and gathered its fruits. They had traded cautiously with the Skraelings and fought when necessary to protect their settlement. The Norse had seen both the generosity and the dangers of the land, learning that abundance alone could not secure survival without vigilance, preparation, and adaptability. Vinland, rich and promising, remained a land of opportunity tempered by caution. Leif's men understood that while the soil, the forests, and the rivers offered immense rewards, the Skraelings' presence and their own limited numbers meant that long-term settlement required more than courage. It required strategy, patience, and sometimes the wisdom to leave. This understanding would shape the next chapter of their journey, guiding decisions about whether to establish permanent colonies or return home with knowledge, resources, and tales of a world far beyond the Atlantic horizon. Part 3 concludes here, capturing the daily life in Vinland, the delicate interactions and conflicts with the Skraelings, and the growing understanding among the Norse that abundance alone could not ensure survival. The next part will explore how the Norse navigated these challenges, harvested Vinland's resources, and ultimately made the difficult decision to leave this promising land. As weeks turned into months, Leif Erikson and his crew had learned to navigate Vinland's abundant resources with increasing skill and caution. Timber was perhaps the most valuable of all. The Norse, accustomed to the sparse woodlands of Greenland, marveled at the forests that stretched across the land. Oaks, pines, and birches provided material not only for building shelters, but also for repairing ships and crafting tools that could endure harsh winters. Teams of men worked tirelessly, felling trees, shaping logs into beams, and stacking timber for transport. They learned to use simple levers and ropes to move heavy trunks, often employing clever techniques passed down through generations of Greenlandic settlers. Alongside timber, the rivers and streams offered a near-limitless bounty of fish. Salmon, fat and abundant, leapt into waiting nets, while eels, perch and other freshwater species supplemented the Norse diet. Men took turns fishing in shifts, ensuring that supplies remained plentiful and that exhaustion did not compromise safety. Berries, wild grapes, blueberries and cranberries were gathered by women and men alike. Grapes, in particular, were pressed and stored as a rudimentary wine, their abundance a symbolic reminder of the land's promise. Wild game added protein and variety to the diet. Deer were hunted in the dense forests, while waterfowl provided both sustenance and feathers for practical uses. Despite Vinland's generosity, the presence of the Skraelings remained a constant concern. Skirmishes, though less frequent than in the first weeks, served as reminders that the land was contested. The Norse established early warning systems along the shore and cleared paths through the forests to monitor potential movements of the native people. They carried weapons at all times and maintained patrols in key areas, balancing the need for security with the desire to explore and utilize the land. Diplomacy, though fragile, remained a tool. Trade was attempted when possible, with iron tools, red cloth and milk exchanged for pelts and food. These encounters, while tense, offered glimpses of what peaceful coexistence might have looked like had numbers and circumstances been different. Leif understood that Vinland's greatest strength was also its greatest challenge. Its richness, timber, fish, fertile soil and wild grapes drew Norse attention constantly, but without enough people to defend the settlement, every venture into the forests or along the shoreline carried risk. Small parties returned from scouting missions with tales of fertile clearings, rivers full of fish, and stands of grapes, yet always with reports of Skraeling observation nearby. The Norse realized that to establish a permanent colony would require more manpower, alliances, and infrastructure than they currently possessed. The decision to leave Vinland was not taken lightly. Leif gathered his men to discuss the realities they faced. The consensus was pragmatic. The resources could be harvested, stories could be carried home, but holding the land permanently with such a small force was impossible. The settlement was rich, yes, but isolated. The Skraelings were numerous and vigilant. The Atlantic was unpredictable, and winter, though milder than Greenland's, could still prove dangerous. A permanent foothold might bring more glory, but it also risked the lives of all involved. Preparations for departure began in earnest. Timber was cut, carefully shaped and stacked to maximize space aboard the Nar. Fish were salted, smoked or dried for transport. Grapes were pressed into barrels, berries were packed into sacks, and game was butchered, preserved and stored. Every item taken was carefully selected, ensuring that the return voyage would be laden with proof of Vinland's abundance. The process of leaving was bittersweet. Men who had dreamed of families and farms in this fertile land now accepted that survival and prudence dictated retreat. Some carried heavy hearts, mourning the potential of a settlement that could never fully be realized. Others, however, felt relief at returning to familiar lands, carrying not only resources, but also the hard-earned knowledge of what lay across the Atlantic. Before departure, Leif oversaw a final inspection of the settlement. Temporary shelters were dismantled where possible, fires were extinguished, and areas of strategic importance were noted. The Nar's crew took a last look at Vinland's forests, rivers, and beaches. Each man silently reflected on the voyage, the vast, untamed land, the moments of wonder, the skirmishes with the Skraelings, and the vision of what might have been. Vinland, for all its promise, remained a place of potential rather than permanence. The voyage back across the Atlantic was both familiar and challenging. The Nar, laden with timber, barrels of grapes, dried fish, and preserved game, rode the northern currents once more. Navigation relied on sun and stars, birds, and the smell of land on the wind. The North Atlantic, temperamental as ever, tested the Norse with sudden storms and frigid waves, yet the experience gained from the outward journey proved invaluable. The crew worked in coordinated shifts, keeping the ship on course while maintaining provisions and morale. Tales of Vinland's abundance were shared aboard the Nar, ensuring that the memory of the new land remained vivid, even as Greenland approached on the horizon. Upon returning to Greenland, the crew was greeted with both relief and admiration. The timber brought back was of unprecedented quality, reshaping the construction possibilities for Greenlandic settlers. Grapes and berries, though perishable, were shared among the community, giving a taste of Vinland's bounty and solidifying the story of a land beyond the Atlantic. Fish, salted and smoked, provided sustenance through the harsh Greenlandic winters. The sagas recorded these returns with reverence, emphasizing not only the material wealth brought back, but also the courage and skill required to undertake such a voyage. Vinland's legacy did not end with this initial expedition. Subsequent Norse voyages, inspired by life's journey, sought to explore and exploit its resources, though none established a permanent settlement. The sagas speak of later expeditions, such as those led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, which brought more men and even attempted to maintain longer-term habitation. Yet the pattern remained. Abundant land tempered by the realities of conflict, isolation, and limited manpower. For generations, Vinland existed in the collective memory of Norse society. It became a symbol of exploration, ambition, and the limits of human endeavor. The land itself remained largely unclaimed by the Norse, yet it inspired tales told around hearths in Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. The narratives emphasized not just the resources found, but the lessons learned, the importance of prudence, preparation, and respect for those who already called a land home. In modern times, the legend of Vinland has been substantiated by archaeological discoveries, including Norse turf houses in Newfoundland. These findings confirmed that Leif Erikson and his crew did indeed reach North America nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. The evidence, both material and textual, highlights the extraordinary reach of Norse seafarers and the ingenuity required to survive in distant lands. Leif Erikson's decision to return to Greenland, though marked by the necessity of prudence, ensured the survival of his crew and preserved the knowledge of Vinland for posterity. The timber, grapes, and other resources brought back provided both practical benefits and proof that lands of immense wealth lay across the Atlantic. His voyages became foundational in the Norse understanding of the wider world, expanding both geographic knowledge and the scope of ambition. Ultimately, Vinland's story is one of opportunity tempered by caution. It demonstrates the extraordinary abilities of the Norse to navigate, explore, and utilize distant lands, while simultaneously acknowledging the limits imposed by numbers, resources, and indigenous resistance. Vinland remained a fleeting foothold, a testament to both human curiosity and the necessity of strategic retreat. The saga of Leif Erikson and his return from Vinland would echo for generations. It was a narrative of courage, exploration, and survival, capturing the imagination of Norse society and eventually the wider world. Though the land was not permanently claimed, Vinland's discovery marked a milestone in human exploration, providing a glimpse of lands beyond the known and igniting the enduring dream that the Atlantic could be crossed and that new worlds awaited those willing to venture beyond the horizon. The Norse return from Vinland marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Though Leif Erikson and his crew had left the land physically, the stories of their journey endured in the hearts and minds of those who remained in Greenland and Iceland, Fireside tales recounted the lush forests, the abundant rivers teeming with fish, and the wild grapes that gave the land its name. Each retelling emphasized not only the practical resources brought back, but also the courage and endurance required to reach a continent so far beyond the known world. The timber brought from Vinland revolutionized building in Greenland. Previously, settlers had relied on stone and scarce wood, often enduring harsh winters with poorly insulated homes. With planks and beams harvested from Vinland, houses could be sturdier, ships could be repaired more effectively, and tools could be fashioned with greater reliability. Even small touches, a beam in a home, a plank in a boat, carried the memory of Vinland, a tangible proof that lands of plenty existed beyond the Atlantic. Yet the legacy of Vinland extended far beyond physical resources. For the Norse, it became a symbol of human possibility and exploration. The idea that lands lay beyond horizons previously unimagined inspired subsequent expeditions, such as those of Thorfinn Karlsefni, Bjarni Herjolfsson, and others who sought to establish more lasting contacts or settlements in the western reaches of the Atlantic. These later ventures faced similar challenges: distance, isolation, unpredictable weather, and resistance from the Skraelings. While permanent colonies never took root, the voyages collectively expanded Norse geographic knowledge and demonstrated the limits of endurance in unknown lands. The sagas preserved these journeys with remarkable detail and reverence. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red recorded not only the locations and resources of Vinland, but also the interactions with the Skraelings. These accounts describe early trade, initial curiosity and cooperation, and ultimately the inevitable conflict that arose from cultural misunderstandings and competition for resources. Arrows and stones were exchanged, settlements were defended, and the fragility of small Norse parties in foreign lands became evident. Even moments of heroism, such as the tales of Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red, who confronted the Skraelings with bravery, were preserved to illustrate courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Vinland's story also carried a moral dimension in the sagas. It demonstrated the importance of prudence, patience, and the recognition of limits. Leif Erikson, though ambitious and curious, knew when to retreat. He returned with resources, knowledge, and stories, preserving the well-being of his crew. The sagas emphasize that wisdom lay not only in discovering new lands, but also in understanding when survival outweighed conquest. This lesson became central to Norse culture, shaping attitudes toward future voyages and the expansion of settlements elsewhere. For centuries, Vinland remained largely mythic to those outside the Norse world. European scholars and chroniclers knew little of lands across the Atlantic beyond the tales that filtered through Icelandic texts. To many, the notion that Norsemen had reached North America seemed fanciful, almost legendary, yet for the Norse, Vinland's reality was undeniable. Timber, grapes, fish, and fresh knowledge of Western lands confirmed that human endeavor could extend far beyond familiar shores. Archaeological discoveries in modern times have confirmed the saga's accounts. Excavations at Les Anse-aux Meadows in Newfoundland revealed turf houses and artifacts unmistakably Norse in design and origin. These findings provided concrete evidence that around the year 1000 CE, Norse explorers had indeed set foot on North American soil. The site showed clear signs of temporary settlement, including living spaces, workshops, and storage areas. The presence of iron tools and artifacts unique to Norse culture corroborated the written sagas, bridging myth and history. Vinland's story is also a tale of cross-cultural encounters. The Norse understood the land as abundant and open for settlement, while the Skraelings regarded it as their own. Early attempts at trade demonstrated curiosity and willingness to engage, but cultural differences and competition for resources quickly escalated into conflict. These interactions reflect broader patterns in human history. Encounters between differing peoples can yield knowledge, goods, and alliances, but also misunderstanding and hostility. For the Norse, Vinland taught that no amount of preparation could fully mitigate the challenges of entering foreign lands without established networks or sufficient manpower. Despite the inability to establish a permanent colony, Vinland inspired imagination and ambition. The Norse proved that the Atlantic could be crossed, that lands lay beyond Greenland's ice, and that human settlement in new worlds was possible. The tales of Vinland spread throughout Icelandic society, providing inspiration for subsequent generations of explorers and seafarers. Even though the land itself remained largely uncolonized, its symbolic significance endured. Vinland represented the possibilities beyond the horizon and the courage required to reach them. The voyages of Leif Erikson also reframed the Norse understanding of their world. Previously, the known world ended at Greenland's western coast, with icy seas marking the boundary of human habitation. Vinland expanded the mental map of the North Atlantic, revealing that fertile lands existed far beyond the reach of Greenlandic settlers. This knowledge influenced future planning for voyages, trade routes, and the selection of settlement locations, highlighting the strategic importance of exploration for survival and prosperity. In Greenland, the timber, wine, and other resources brought from Vinland had immediate practical benefits, but they also reinforced a sense of confidence and pride in Norse capabilities. Communities saw that survival in harsh northern environments did not preclude adventure and discovery. The voyages reminded them that skill, courage, and cooperation could allow humans to thrive even in distant and challenging lands. The Norse sagas, recounted around fires in winter, celebrated these achievements, embedding them in cultural memory as stories of triumph, endurance, and exploration. Over time, Vinland's narrative became intertwined with the broader saga of Norse exploration. It was a bridge between Greenland, Iceland, and the land's far west, a testament to the ingenuity and daring of seafaring communities. The lessons learned about navigation, survival, diplomacy, and restraint were transmitted orally and in written form, shaping the ethos of Norse voyaging. These stories influenced not only Norse understanding of distant lands, but also the wider medieval European imagination, even if indirectly and over centuries. Vinland's discovery, though brief in temporal terms, highlighted a fundamental truth about human endeavor. Exploration is as much about the journey and knowledge gained as it is about permanent possession. Leif Erikson's voyage exemplifies the blend of courage, curiosity, and pragmatism that defines successful exploration. He recognized both opportunity and limitation, ambition and prudence, ensuring that the Norse not only reached new lands, but also returned with the resources and stories necessary to enrich their communities. In the long view, Vinland serves as a precursor to later European exploration. While Columbus's voyages would eventually reshape global history, the Norse achievement preceded him by nearly 5 centuries, proving that transatlantic navigation was possible and that distant continents could be reached from Europe's northern extremes. Vinland's saga endures as a reminder of human ingenuity, daring, and the enduring quest to explore the unknown. Today, Vinland is remembered through both historical scholarship and cultural memory. The tales of Leif Erikson are celebrated in Icelandic, Greenlandic, and broader Scandinavian traditions. Monuments, museums, and educational curricula recognize the significance of these early explorations. Archaeological evidence provides tangible proof that the sagas, though embellished in storytelling, reflect true historical events. Vinland thus occupies a dual space, part myth, part verified history, bridging imagination and reality. The story of Vinland ultimately is one of potential realized and constrained. It shows the power of vision and courage while acknowledging the practical limits faced by pioneers in distant lands. Leif Erikson and his crew did not conquer Vinland. They experienced it, documented it, and returned to share its bounty. The lessons of prudence, courage, and adaptation resonate as strongly today as they did a millennium ago, offering insight into the human capacity for exploration, resilience, and reflection. In summary, Vinland's legacy is multifaceted. It is a testament to Norse navigation, ingenuity, and endurance. It is a story of cross-cultural encounters, resource utilization, and cautious pragmatism. It bridges the gap between myth and history, inspiring generations to look beyond the horizon and consider what might lie across distant waters. And finally, Vinland is a story of memory. The memory of forests, rivers, grapes, and the daring men and women who first set foot on North American soil, ensuring that even fleeting encounters with new worlds can leave an indelible mark on human consciousness. The Atlantic had been crossed, Vinland had been touched, and though permanent settlement eluded the Norse, the legacy of exploration, ambition, and discovery remained. For Leif Erikson, Vinland was both a triumph and a lesson. The world was vast. Opportunity existed, but prudence and survival always had to guide human ambition. And so, the story of Vinland endures, a bridge between the imagination of the past and the knowledge of the present, a tale of courage, discovery, and the enduring human spirit.